of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Please be seated. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all this morning. It is great to have the kids back here singing. This is their first Sunday back after the summer, so we're delighted to have them back, leading us in worship this morning. Today we continue in Matthew's Gospel, and I just get such a kick out of Peter this morning. This past week, the more I thought about it, the more tickled I got. Because Peter, of course, he's very much in touch with this eye for an eye world in which we live. It's very much an eye for an eye world. And so Peter wants to know, Jesus, what's the rule on forgiveness? How does that work? As your disciple, what's expected of me? And you can be sure he's thought this through, because he wants to be seen in a favorable way by Jesus and the other disciples. And so he wants to know, how many times should I be willing to forgive another? How many times should I be willing to forgive another? And he's probably thinking to himself, now I could say 3, that's a good number, and even 5 would be a pretty good number, but if I say 7, it's going to make me sound really good. And so Peter says, as many as 7 times, Lord, should I be willing to forgive another? And then, of course, typically, Peter gets shot down. Peter, not 7, maybe 77 times. And then, of course, some translators will even say the Greek here. They'll suggest the Greek isn't about 77 times, but it actually says 7 times 70 times. The point is, it's not about a number. That's the point. When Jesus talks about forgiveness, he's challenging us to understand that it's not about keeping up with a number throughout the day or the week. And once you reach that number, you can sort of back off a bit. You can sort of hold grudges a little bit more after you've done your limit. You've reached your goal for the week. It's not about that. Jesus is trying to communicate to us here this morning that forgiveness is about, he would suggest that there is a spirit of forgiveness. There is a spirit of forgiveness that should permeate our lives. We should always lean toward forgiveness. We should walk in a tendency to forgive. As Christians, people who have been, just like the king in this morning's, that wonderful parable this morning, until you get to the end, this wonderful parable where this king forgives this slave so much. That's what it's like for us. The king says, God says to us, how can I forgive you so much in your life and you not be willing to show more mercy to the people around you? How is that? How could you do that? Jesus is suggesting to us today that it's not about a number. It's about a spirit of forgiveness that should permeate the whole of my life and yours. And yet, I bet that you and I treat it the same way that we treat a lot of other parts of our Christian experience. See, a lot of folks think that they look at it the way Peter is this morning. What's the rule on this? As a disciple of Christ, what does God demand of me? What is my obligation to God as a disciple of Christ? I remember having a woman in my office this was some time ago. She and I had spent time together back when she was in an abusive relationship. And we had worked through that. I had tried to help her with that or hold her for a while she was trying to figure out what she would do in this relationship. And we were working with the other person as well. And finally, this particular meeting took place after the relationship, after she had moved out of this relationship that she was in. She came to me one day, and it was just a wonderful moment because it's so typical of the way we think. And we think this way because this is the way the church has conditioned us to think, the church and its failing. The church has conditioned us to think that, Rick, I'm kind of obligated to forgive him, aren't I? And I said, obligated? Yeah. She says, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. God's forgiven me a great deal in my life. I'm supposed to forgive him. And I said, I wish you wouldn't look at it that way. You're treating it like this obligation, this heavy burden that God's laid on your life, something that you have to do to please God. I said, forgiveness is not a burden. Forgiveness isn't an obligation that God lays on us, something we have to do because we've been forgiven. Forgiveness is a gift. Forgiveness is this wonderful gift. It's like grace. It's like God's love. God doesn't shove that stuff on us. God doesn't make you accept his grace or accept his love. This isn't a knee in the chest God. That's how the church has failed. We've failed to tell the story in a way that's consistent with the gospel. This isn't a knee in the chest God. This is a God who makes his grace, his love, his favor, his forgiveness. This wonderful gift of forgiveness, this is a God who makes this forgiveness available to us as a tool. It's a gift that God has entrusted to us to use so that you and I might not stay in the hate and the hurt. That's what I was able to help her to understand. This isn't something you have to do to please anybody else. God's not sort of keeping a ledger on your life. This bad teaching. God's not doing that. God has given us a gift. God doesn't want you to be in that hate for him. God doesn't want you to be in that hurt anymore. God wants you to be able to move out of that place. That's what forgiveness is all about. It's this wonderful gift that God's given to us. But boy, it's hard work, isn't it? It's easier to talk about forgiveness than it is to do it, isn't it? We really are. We hold those grudges, don't we? I was thinking about Corrie Ten Boom this past week. You remember Corrie Ten Boom, who wrote The Hiding Place? She was liberated from a Nazi concentration camp just after Germany surrendered in the Second World War. And Corrie Ten Boom was a person of faith. She was a remarkable woman. And she was a person of extraordinary faith, obviously. And after the war, she began to study forgiveness because she knew that for her to be able to move on with her life, she had to figure out and understand this gift of forgiveness even more in her life. And so she eventually began to get in touch with forgiveness, God's forgiveness, in a way that helped her to understand that the only hope for Europe at that time, in her mind, the only hope for post-war Europe, this is similar to the story in South Africa some years ago after the apartheid, right? The only hope for South Africa after apartheid was not retributive justice, it was restorative justice. It wasn't about demanding retribution. It was looking for ways to invite restoration. In the same way, Corrie Ten Boom looked at Europe and said, this has got to be the forgiveness of God, the gift of this extraordinary gift of forgiveness. This is the hope for Europe. This is the hope for the planet. And she began to move around teaching on forgiveness. All over Europe, Holland, France, Germany primarily, is where she did her preaching and teaching. And then one day, she talks about after a conference, this fellow comes up to her and says, talks about how delighted he was to learn of this Jesus who forgives us so much. And as soon as he's standing there talking to her, she recognizes him from the death camp. Oh, this was in Munich, Germany after the war. She recognizes him as one of the guards in the death camp. And she doesn't remember him very well at all. I'm being nice. In fact, after he sort of compliments her for her sermon or her preaching, her teaching, he then reaches out his hand to shake hers. Now, this is the woman who has been doing this work on forgiveness, and she's preaching forgiveness to everybody else. And she said, I was frozen right there. She said, I stood right there. She said, I couldn't take his hand. She says, I could not. I knew everything about it. I knew everything about forgiveness. She says, I thought I was farther along in this process of doing this work of forgiveness, this messy work of forgiveness, this hard work of forgiveness. Said, I thought I was a little further along, but she said, I could not take his hand. In fact, the first thing she did was she ran to be with her God. And she said, God, I'm so sorry. I thought I was in a different place in my life. I thought that I had found some liberation from what had happened to me and my family during the war, but she said, and she asked God, please forgive me. God, please forgive me for not being what I needed to be there in that moment, both for myself and for that man. And God would not look upon her in a disfavorable way. God would just see her as doing the important work of trying desperately to forgive. It is a process. For a lot of us, it's not something you can do in the moment. For some of us, it's something you have to step back from, and you have to work through it. But to begin to even work through it, even if you can't forgive in the moment, to engage in the process or the work of forgiveness is to begin to acknowledge the presence of God in that struggle or in that skirmish that you're having with another. In that moment is to begin to move to a place of liberation from the hate and the hurt of that old wound or the pain that was so much a part of that old relationship. Forgiveness is not easy. It is very, very, can be very, very hard work. But when you leave here this morning, just remember this. Forgiveness is not an obligation that God lays on us any more than God's grace or God's love. Forgiveness is a gift that God's given to each one of us. And the more that you mature in the life that is Jesus, the more that you are here bathing ever deeper in the wonder of God's amazing grace and love and the power of that forgiving love every week, the more you would bring your children into that story, the more we begin to understand it all of it, as gift that has the power to set us free from the hate and the hurt. Amen.